Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program for Monday, March 20th, 2023. We're going to be getting started in just a moment. You can see the title of tonight's program is An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe. Our speaker is Benjamin Madley. So just sit back and relax. We're going to be starting in just a moment or two. We're going to let folks come in from the waiting room. Thanks. Hey, if you've joined us, we're going to be getting started in just a moment or so. We're letting folks join us from the waiting room. If you're here for the Book Club of California's live online program, again, for Monday, March 20th, you're in the right place. It's titled An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. We're going to be getting started again in just a moment or two, so just sit back and relax. Okay, we're a few minutes past the top of the hour, and we do have a lot of folks registered for this webinar. So we're going to get started and let them join us in progress. I think it's probably the best way to go about it. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Book Club of California's live online program titled An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. My name is Kevin Kosick, and I'm the Executive Director of the Book Club of California, and it's my pleasure to welcome you and host the webinar this evening. As I said, we have quite a number of folks joining us this evening. We have about 200 people registered for this presentation. So for those of you who might be new to us, the Book Club of California is a nonprofit, member and donor-supported organization that is dedicated to preserving and promoting the history of the book and the book arts. Oftentimes, we do that with a focus on the literature and the history of California and the West. The book club publishes limited edition books, a scholarly journal, and keepsakes. We host a year-round series of exhibitions and programs like the one this evening on topics including fine printing, design, typography, bookbinding, collecting, California history, and much, much more. Now, if you're not a member, or if your membership has lapsed and you're interested in what we do, please consider joining our century-long tradition. Our membership dues are modest, but the benefits are many, and we simply can't do the work of the book club without our members and our supporters. So I encourage you to visit us online at bccbooks.org to join or donate to the book club. And now for tonight's program and our presenter. The program is titled An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 to 1873. It is a live online presentation by Benjamin Madley. Now, Benjamin Madley is the Associate Professor of History at the University of California, Los Angeles. He studies Native America, the United States, and colonialism in world history. He holds a BA, an MA, a master's in philosophy, and a PhD from Yale University, and a master in studies from Oxford University. Born in Redding, California, Benjamin Madley spent much of his childhood in Karuk country, near the Oregon border, where he became interested in relations between colonizers and indigenous peoples. In 2002, after a period spent working in the San Francisco Bay Area and hiking more than 600 miles of the Pacific Crest Trail through California, He began working on a PhD in history at Yale, returning to California in 2006 through 2010 to conduct research in multiple California archives and to visit California Indian nations. Now, our speaker taught at Dartmouth College for 2 years as an Andrew Mellon postdoctoral fellow in the history department and Native American Studies program. In 2012, he joined the faculty at UCLA, where he teaches courses in American Indian history, United States history, and genocide in world history. He is currently a long-term fellow at the Huntington Library in San Marino, California. Benjamin Madley's book, An American Genocide, the United States and the California Indian Catastrophe, 1846 through 1873, is the first full account of the government-sanctioned genocide of California Indians under United States rule. It has been widely praised as groundbreaking, raising fundamental questions about how Californians and Americans think of themselves and their history. Between 1846 and 1873, California's Indian population plunged from perhaps 1,500 to 30,000. 150,000 to 30,000. Now, tonight, our speaker will discuss the extent of the slaughter, the involvement of state and federal officials, indigenous resistance, who did the killing, the taxpayer dollars that supported it, and why the killings ended. Now, if you have questions for our speaker, please use the chat and the Q&A functions in Zoom. I'll check both of those right after I get off screen to make sure that they're working. And we should have time at the top of the hour to take questions and have a discussion. And I'll curate those from the chat and the Q&A. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Benjamin Madley. Benjamin, it's all yours.
Mr. Kosick, thank you so much for that very kind and warm welcome. Before we get started, I'd like to say a few things by way of preamble. First of all, I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from the University of California, Los Angeles, which is on the ancestral and unceded territory of the Tongva Gabrielino people who have lived in Tovaangar, this area, for more than 14,000 years. I also want to acknowledge that wherever you are in the great state of California, you are on Indian land. And in fact, wherever you go this evening, even if you hop on a plane and fly to the shores of the Arctic Ocean or to the tip of Patagonia, everywhere you go in the Western Hemisphere is someone's ancient and ancestral territory. I also want to just warn you that the material that we're going to cover this evening is extremely difficult and emotionally challenging. If at any time you need to go, please feel free to do so. There we go. The ceremony continued until just before dawn. Illuminated by a central fire, the celebrants moved together in ancient rhythms, the women's clamshell necklaces clicking softly against their seashell dresses. Male dancers, attired as birds, deer, or hunters, supported the females in their heavy regalia. Meanwhile, singers raised their voices heavenward with the songs of knee dash, the feather dance. Between songs, singers offered prayers of thanks, not only for the creation of this wonderful world in which we are privileged to live, but also for its renewal and recreation in each and every moment. Finally, the celebrants stopped and walked away arm in arm under a full moon. Nearby, they passed through small round doorways into snug redwood plank houses with gently sloping roofs. Outside, Lake Earl lapped at the shore. Inside, the Tolowa Di'ini and their native guests slept next to kith and kin. The celebrants were unaware that less than 7 miles away, Crescent City men had established their own branch of California's expanding killing machine. Crescent City's Coast Rangers and Klamath Mounted Rangers had been well armed by the governor of California, John Bigler. He had provided them with 20 muskets, 25 rifles, dozens of swords, and thousands of rounds of ammunition. They now prepared to do one thing and one thing only: kill Native American people. In the pre-dawn hours of the final day of 1854, as many as 116 California state militiamen and an unknown number of auxiliaries quietly surrounded the village and took up concealed positions in the brush, behind the brows of dunes, or in the shadows of boulders. At daybreak, as women, men, children, and elders emerged to greet the new day, the militiamen and vigilantes opened fire. They shot them down, says one participant, just as fast as we could reload our weapons. Possessing only 3 guns themselves, the Tolowa Diini and their guests were unable to defend themselves. A few plunged into Lake Earl. There, they too became targets. Those who swam across the lake encountered a second group of killers lying in wait on the opposite shore. When the shooting stopped, perhaps hundreds lay dead and dying. Not more than 5 of the Nidash celebrants survived. The attackers apparently suffered a single casualty, and the state of California later paid these militiamen for their work. This massacre was part of an American genocide. Between 1846 and 1870, California's indigenous population plummeted from perhaps 150,000 people to not more than 30,000 survivors. Diseases, dislocation, and starvation caused many of these deaths. However, abduction, unfree labor, mass death on federal Indian reservations, homicides, battles, and more than 300 documented massacres also took the lives of thousands and hindered reproduction. This was, in fact, a case of genocide. So, what do I mean when I use this politically freighted, even explosive word? For a prosecutor in an international court to successfully convict a defendant of the crime of genocide, they must prove 2 things beyond any reasonable shadow of a doubt. First, they must establish what they call special intent. That is, the intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Second, they must prove that the defendant committed at least one of the 5 genocidal crimes enumerated here. The convention thus provides a clear, internationally recognized rubric for evaluating instances of genocide, including historical cases not subject to legal jurisdiction. Now, following the formulation of this new international legal treaty, scholars began re-examining the colonization of California by the United States. By the year 2000, more than 20 scholars deemed events here between 1846 and 1873 to have been a case of genocide. Still, relatively little has been written about it, at least compared to other genocides. Building on previous scholarship, an American genocide is the first comprehensive recounting of genocide in California during these years. This topic calls for meticulous attention because the stakes are high for scholars, California Indian people, and all US citizens. If US citizens founded some areas of California, if not the state as a whole, upon deliberate attempts to annihilate California Indians, scholars will need to re-evaluate current interpretive axioms and address new questions. Scholars could, for example, re-examine the widespread assumption that it was the indirect effects of colonization, like epidemic diseases, rather than deliberate actions, like murder, that were the leading cause of death among California Indian people. Exceptionalist interpretations of US history lose validity as researchers compare California to other mass killings in global history. A careful study of genocide in California may also assist scholars in re-examining the larger hemispheric population catastrophe in the Americas. What tended to catalyze genocide? Who ordered the killing? Who bloodied their hands carrying it out? Why do we not know more about these events? Did democracy drive mass murder? And ultimately, what role might genocide have played in the forging of the modern nation states, the United States, Canada, Mexico, and the others in the Western Hemisphere? The genocide question is particularly urgent for California's approximately 150,000 California Indian people. In my visits to reservations and to urban indigenous communities, I have gathered a host of questions. Should they press for government apologies, reparations, and control of land where genocidal events took place? Will they be able to marshal evidence of genocide involving tribal sovereignty and federal recognition cases? How should they commemorate victims of mass murder while simultaneously emphasizing successful accommodation, resistance, survival, and cultural renewal? The psychological issues related to genocide are also fraught. What happens when a tribal member learns that she is the descendant of both perpetrators and victims? How might California Indian people reconcile increased knowledge of genocide, sometimes at the hands of employees of the United States, with their often intense patriotism? Finally, and perhaps most importantly, what role might acknowledgement of genocide have on the intergenerational historical trauma prevalent in many California Indian communities, and that trauma's connection to present day physical illnesses, substance abuse, domestic violence, and the highest rates of youth suicide in the state of California? The question of genocide in California under US rule also poses explosive questions for all US citizens. Should government officials tender public apologies, as Presidents Ronald Reagan and George Herbert Walker did in the 1980s for the relocation and internment of some 120,000 Japanese Americans during the Second World War? We now know that Gavin Newsom, our current governor, has offered such an apology. But there are follow-on questions. Should state or federal officials offer compensation along the lines of the more than $1.6 billion that Congress has paid out to 82,210 Japanese Americans and their heirs for internment during World War II? Might California state officials decrease their cut of California Indian gaming revenue as a way of paying reparations? A better understanding of genocide in California might also impact the federal government's dealings with the scores of California Indian communities currently seeking federal recognition from Washington, D.C. The question of commemoration is closely linked. Will non-Indian people support or even tolerate the public commemoration of mass murders committed by some of this state's forefathers with the same kinds of public monuments, museums, and state legislated days of remembrance that today commemorate, for example, the Armenian Genocide and the Holocaust? Will genocides against California Indian people join these mass murders in California public school curricula and public discourse? These questions are all extremely important, but can only be addressed in limited ways without a comprehensive understanding of relations between California Indian people and newcomers between 1846 and 1873. Sporadic mass killing of California Indian people punctuated the initial years of US rule in California. But it was James Marshall's 1848 gold strike that precipitated a local genocide. Oregon men played a leading role in increasing violence against California Indian people. These Oregonians rarely had connections to California's Hispanic economy and society, in which indigenous people played important roles. And many of these Oregonians saw Indians as little more than dangerous obstacles to the rapid acquisition of wealth. In 1849, Oregonian attacks on California Indians increased in both frequency and lethality, particularly in the central mines pictured here, where the gold rush was booming. One 49er explained, and I quote, "Oregon people had been used to shooting Indians, and they did shoot them freely. That April, Theodore Johnson entered the epicenter of this local genocide, Coloma, near Sutter's Mill, where Marshall had first found gold. In the central mines, Johnson and others recounted multiple massacres, scalpings, and the slaying of surrendered California Indians. Due to spotty primary source coverage, there were not yet any newspapers being published in the mines. We will never know the precise number of California Indian people murdered by newcomers in and around the mines in 1849 and early 1850. Yet hundreds, if not thousands, may have suffered violent deaths. What was clear to contemporary observers was the exterminatory nature of such killings, both in their intent and their impact. In December of 1849, Pomo and Wapo Indian people, held as unfree laborers, rose up and killed their two white captors near Clear Lake, north of San Francisco Bay. In response to this double homicide, vigilantes and regular United States Army soldiers killed as many as 1,000 Indian people or more between Christmas 1849 and May 15th, 1850. Vigilantes first murdered and massacred large numbers of Native American people in the Napa and Sonoma valleys. Then, after authorities arrested some of these vigilantes, California's Supreme Court let all 8 of them go on bail. It was California's first Supreme Court case. Meanwhile, the US Army also sought to avenge the deaths of the 2 white ranchers. In a San Francisco article titled "Horrible Slaughter of Indians," one journalist described a massacre committed by the United States Army on an island in Clear Lake, using information provided by a regular United States Army captain. And I quote, "Little or no resistance was encountered, and the work of butchery was of but short duration. Neither sex nor age were spared. It was the order of extermination fearfully obeyed," end quote. As many as 800 California Indian people died that day. Other killings followed, and the officers involved were not censured. All of them received promotions. And a new factor was now at work: large-scale, extended vigilante and US Army killing campaigns tolerated by both state and federal authorities. As the gold rush continued, immigrants surged into the state. Before the gold rush, there were perhaps 13 or maybe 14,000 non-Indian people in California. 1860 census takers enumerated more than 360,000. The newcomers came primarily in search of wealth, but in seeking to access gold, eat, dress, acquire labor, and satisfy their sexual appetites, immigrants placed immense pressures on California Indian people. These demands triggered explosions of ranching, hunting, mining, and slave raiding. These activities generated shockwaves that had a devastating impact on California Indians. California's new leaders magnified that impact. Under martial law, US military officers made California Indians into second-class citizens with few civil rights. California's 1849 Constitution then made it nearly impossible for Indian people to vote. And in 1850, California's first legislature banned all Indians from voting, barred Indians with 1/2 of Indian blood or more from giving evidence for or against whites in criminal cases, and banned all Indians from serving as jurors. The legislature later barred Indians from working as attorneys or judges. In combination, these laws shut Indian people out of participation in and protection by the new state's legal system. Abduction played a major role in California's indigenous population catastrophe. In the year 1850, legislators passed an Act for the Government and Protection of Indians, which legalized white custody of Indian minors and Indian prisoner leasing, while allowing courts and juries to summarily reject Indian testimony. Indian people could thus be forced into unpaid work for indefinite periods based upon trumped-up charges. We're seeing here a handbill in French, essentially advertising an Indian person to be sold as a slave. In 1860, legislators extended the 1850 Act to legalize indenture of any Indian. These laws triggered a boom in violent kidnappings while separating women from men during peak reproductive years, both of which accelerated California's Indian population decline. Some California Indian people were also treated as disposable laborers. One lawyer recollected, and I quote, "Los Angeles had its slave mart, and thousands of honest, useful people were absolutely destroyed in this way," end quote. Between 1850 and 1870, the Los Angeles Indian population fell from 3,693 to just 219 survivors. Escape was one way that California Indian people defied servitude, but whites sometimes responded with overwhelming lethal force. The Lasik Wailaki woman Lucy Young, who we see in portrait here, escaped servitude multiple times. She recollected, and I quote, "Young woman been stole by white people, come back, shot through lights and liver, front skin hang down like apron. She tie up with cotton dress, never die neither," end quote. Others were less fortunate. After one California Indian woman fled her, quote, "lord and master with his Indian boy," end quote, in 1858, whites massacred some 15 California Indian people. 2 years later, a rancher on the Van Dusen River became so incensed after his 7-year-old Indian servant visited his family half a mile away that he, quote, "slaughtered the whole family of about 6 persons, boy and all," end quote. Despite such reports, policymakers failed to intervene while almost all law enforcement officials turned a blind eye. The United States Congress, meanwhile, made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to immigration's blast. In 1851 and 1852, federal agents signed 18 different treaties with 119 California Indian leaders, allocating them some 7,488,000 acres. However, in Washington, D.C., U.S. senators repudiated these treaties. Instead, in 1853, Congress authorized 5 military reservations not exceeding 25,000 acres each, and conferred no legal recognition or land titles. The results were fourfold. First, no reservations were patented, and jurisdiction over them was left uncertain. Second, because jurisdiction remained uncertain, confusion and conflict between and among state and federal authorities prevailed. Third, California Indian people did not become explicit federal wards. Finally, U.S. Army Major General John Wool's 1857 interpretation of California reservations' legal status denied them Army protection. And I quote, "Until these reservations are perfected, the United States troops have no right to exclude the whites from entering and occupying the reserves, or even to prevent them from taking Indians, including women and children," end quote. Federal officials thus made California Indian people particularly vulnerable to kidnapping, slavery, assault, homicide, and massacre. The establishment of California's militia system now marked the rise of a state-sponsored killing machine. Between 1850 and 1861, 3,414 militiamen enrolled in 24 volunteer militia expeditions, killing at least 1,342 California Indian people. However, their impact transcended these numbers. Militiamen served as a widely publicized state endorsement of Indian killing, communicating an unofficial grant of legal impunity for Indian killing and inspiring many more vigilante attacks. Indeed, vigilantes killed more than 6,400 California Indian people between 1846 and 1873. In January 1851, California Governor Peter Burnett declared, and I quote, "that a war of extermination will continue to be waged until the Indian race becomes extinct." The following month, California state legislators voted to borrow $500,000, a vast sum of money at the time, for past and future anti-Indian California militia operations. Meanwhile, the state began building a substantial arsenal in San Francisco based upon weapons and ammunition donated by the U.S. Army. In 1852, United States Senator John Weller, who became California's governor in 1858, told his fellow United States senators in Washington, D.C., that California Indians, quote, "will be exterminated." He insisted, quote, "the interest of the white man demands their extinction." That same year, California state legislators passed a $600,000 bond measure to support additional militia operations, even as vigilante killings continued. We're looking here at one of those bonds. The Sinkyone woman, Sally Bell, seen in portrait in the latter years of her life here, provided a rare California Indian eyewitness account of a massacre that took place in her homeland sometime in the early 1850s. Bell remembered, and I quote, "About 10 o'clock in the morning, some white men came. They killed my grandfather and my mother and my father. I saw them do it. Then they killed my baby sister and cut her heart out and threw it in the brush where I ran and hid. My sister was a baby, just crawling around. I didn't know what to do. I was so scared that I guess I just hid there a long time with my little sister's heart in my hands." It was a terrifying time to be a California Indian person. United States Congress endorsed such killing, even as state and federal leaders perfected the killing machine. In 1854, the United States Congress allocated more than $924,000 to reimburse California for its past militia campaigns. The following year, State Quartermaster and Adjutant General William C. Kibbe, who ran California's militia system from 1852 through 1853, underscored the militia's genocidal purpose. And I quote, "There are but few alternatives before us, viz., either to wage a war of extermination or abandon a large and productive territory." End quote. To help perfect his killing machine, Kibbe wrote a tactical manual and distributed it to his militia officers. Meanwhile, then Secretary of War Jefferson Davis shipped Kibbe U.S. Army tactical manuals to distribute to his militiamen as Christmas gifts. Then, in 1857, California state legislators appropriated an additional $410,000 for militia operations with predictable results. Finally, in 1861, even as disunion was tearing the country apart, Congress appropriated another $400,000 to help pay for California's militia operations. Civilians and officials also carried out large removal campaigns to concentrate California Indian survivors on federal reservations. For example, in 1856, vigilantes massacred 55 people while removing one group to the Mendocino Reservation. The Lake Yakuts woman Yoimut recollected that during the forced removal of her people to the Fresno Reservation, soldiers first killed 12 Indians and then a dozen more during the march. Likewise, the Noam Lackey man Andrew Freeman explained, and I quote, "When they took the Indians to the Round Valley Reservation, they drove them like stock and shot the old people who couldn't make the trip. They would shoot children who were getting tired." Once at federal reservations, California Indian people often encountered institutionalized malnutrition and lethal starvation. The Concow leader, Tomayanem, recollected that after volunteers had forcibly taken his people to Mendocino Reservation, we were very hungry, and the Concows began to die very fast. Other reservations proved little better. In 1860, Tomayanem and his people relocated to Round Valley Reservation, where, he remembered, there was even less to eat. Indeed, in 1860, federal officials typically provided 480 to 910 calories per day to working Round Valley Indians. By 1862, daily rations there fell to 160 to 390 calories per person per day. Further diminishing these already inadequate rations, those who did not work were inadequately fed, if at all. If some California reservation inmates died of institutionalized starvation, malnutrition profoundly weakened the immune systems of others, making them more susceptible to lethal diseases. Starvation and malnutrition also predictably depressed fecundity while increasing miscarriages and stillbirths. Some federal officials and reservation colonists used Indian people there as unpaid laborers with lethal results. According to one colonist, and I quote, "About 300 died on the Round Valley Reservation during the winter of 1856 to 1857 from the effects of packing them through the mountains in the snow and mud. They were worked naked and packed 50 pounds each, if able. At California reservations, willful neglect took an untold number of lives. Federal employees also killed substantial numbers of California Indian peoples more directly. During the US Civil War, 15,725 California men enlisted in the Union Army. Thousands of them remained in California and soon transformed California's killing machine. As US troops, these so-called California volunteers replaced relatively small, short-term militia campaigns with much larger, longer army operations. The Army now fielded the most sustained campaigns yet seen in California. Vigilante operations flourished alongside these campaigns, but the genocide was now primarily a federal project. And US Army forces killed substantial numbers. The first California Volunteers Army campaign in 1862 killed at least 120 California Indian people. Hundreds more would die in succeeding campaigns directed by men like this man, Colonel Henry M. Black. California volunteers also killed prisoners en masse on multiple occasions. Cavalry Captain Moses McLaughlin proudly reported how in 1863, and I quote, "I had all the bucks collected together and 35 were either shot or sabred. None escaped." McLaughlin concluded, "They will soon either be killed off or pushed so far in the surrounding deserts that they will perish by famine." The US Army continued killing California Indian people through the late 1860s. Even after US Army officers concluded their last large-scale operation, the 1872 to 1873 Modoc War, they hanged and then beheaded 4 Modoc prisoners before shipping their severed heads to Washington, D.C. The California Indian Catastrophe fits the 2-part legal definition set forth in the UN Genocide Convention. First, perpetrators demonstrated in word and in deed their intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such. Second, they committed all 5 genocidal acts listed in the convention. Killing members of the group occurred in more than 370 massacres, as well as hundreds of smaller killings, homicides, and executions. Sources indicate that from 1846 to 1873, vigilantes, militiamen, and soldiers killed at least 9,492 to 16,094 California Indians, and probably many, many more. By way of contrast, California Indians killed fewer than 1,400 non-Indians during this same period. Other acts of genocide proliferated too. Many rapes and beatings occurred, and these meet the convention's definition of causing serious bodily harm to victims on the basis of their group identity and with the intent to destroy the group. The sustained military and civilian policy of demolishing California Indian villages and their food stores, often with fire, while driving survivors into inhospitable desert and mountain regions, amounted to deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction, in whole or in part. Some Office of Indian Affairs employees administering federal Indian reservations in California committed the same genocidal crime. Further, because malnutrition and exposure predictably lowered fertility while increasing the number of miscarriages and stillbirths, some state and federal decision makers also appear guilty of imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Finally, the state, slave raiders, and federal officials were all involved in forcibly transferring children of the group to another group. 3,000 to 4,000 or more California Indian children suffered such forced transfers. By breaking up families and shattering whole communities, forced removals also constituted imposing measures intended to prevent births within the group. Sufficient evidence thus exists to designate the California Indian Catastrophe a case of genocide, according to the UN definition. Elected California officials were the primary architects of annihilation. Legislators created a legal environment in which California Indians had almost no rights, thus granting those who attacked them virtual impunity. Moreover, 2 California governors threatened annihilation, and both governors and elected officials cooperated in building a killing machine. California governors called out or authorized no fewer than 24 militia expeditions between 1850 and 1861, which killed a minimum of 1,342 California Indian people. State legislators also raised up to $1.5 million to fund these operations, a tremendous amount of money at that time. By demonstrating that the state would not punish Indian killers, but instead reward them, state militia expeditions inspired an even greater number of vigilante killings. Finally, in 1863, after the US Army supplanted the state militia as the primary state-sponsored Indian killing force, California legislators passed another bill allowing the state to raise an additional $600,000 to encourage more California men to enlist as California volunteers. Yet it is important to understand that the state of California did not act alone. The United States Army played a crucial role in the California genocide, first creating the exclusionary legal system, then setting genocidal precedents, helping to build the killing machine, participating in killing, and finally taking control of it. In total, US Army soldiers killed at least 1,688 to 3,741 California Indian people between 1846 and 1873. If state legislators were the primary architects of genocide, federal officials helped to lay the groundwork, became the final arbiters of the design, and ultimately paid for most of its official execution. By the year 1863, federal officials had given California more than $1 million to pay for its militia campaigns. And of course, by 1863, the US Army had taken over as the primary state-sponsored killer, and Congress controlled that institution's budget. Indeed, federal legislators paid for some or all of the many campaigns against California Indian people that began in 1846 and concluded in 1873. Yet, California Indian people survived and they endure. Thank you.
I'm back. Oh, you're stopping your share. Good. Thank you for that presentation. I'm speechless in many ways. So it was a serious and kind of sobering information that you've shared with us. I do want to say that I really appreciate the land acknowledgement at the top of the talk. I think we often forget about those and paying tribute and acknowledging the lands on which we currently reside. So thank you for doing that. The history of colonization in California and the elimination of the indigenous peoples is an important topic, and it isn't really discussed, I think, enough in some of the presentations that are out there. So thank you for coming and sharing with us. I want to start. There are some great questions in the chat and the Q&A, and I'll invite anyone who is still with us to put your questions or comments in the chat and the Q&A. If we don't get to them all today, I will share them all with Benjamin after tonight's presentation. But I thought we should start a little bit with how you came to this topic in the first place. I talked a little bit about kind of your background and where you spent time, but maybe you can tell us a little bit more about how you came to this and why this has become such an important part of your life and your work.
Sure. So I spent a lot of my childhood growing up in Kodak country near the Klamath River. And so I saw the dangers of driving while Indian. I saw at firsthand the struggle between the Kodak tribe and Shasta people and Yurok and others having to do with the dams, which have been slowly killing many California rivers over the last 8 decades or so. Struggles with the local mine, with forestry, desecrating sacred sites and making it very difficult for people to harvest and gather and live traditional lives. But it wasn't really until I was a graduate student at Oxford, working on my first graduate degree, when I came across material that let me know that the oral histories that I'd heard from Kuruk and Shasta and Yurok people in Siskiyou County were not unusual. And I started to begin to see a pattern there, even though I was studying African history at the time. And the story just got bigger and bigger and bigger as I went through the archives. And it ended up ultimately taking me 10 years to research and write this book because I kept thinking I'd reach a point of diminishing returns. And in fact, even after I finished my doctorate, I stayed in the UC Berkeley archives for another year because I decided there was still more to find. This was a huge story, and that a lot of the killing was actually, in fact, hidden in plain sight.
There's some questions. I'm going to start with one, and I think you've answered it, but I thought we should talk a little bit about it. It has to do with how relocation of the California Indians was considered a genocidal act. And I think you kind of looped back to that when you revisited the United Nations kind of guidelines for what constitutes genocide. Do you want to talk a little bit about, I think people think like relocation as the act was the genocidal kind of trigger, but it might be all of the other specific things in there about, denying, the malnutrition that has caused, the maltreatment, the forced labor, and the other effects that have caused harm. Is that really how it kind of folds under the genocide label?
Yeah, so I think in a lot of genocides, if you start to look for patterns of genocide in world history, there's often discriminatory laws that are hugely prejudicial to the group being targeted by the perpetrators. There are killings that become increasingly organized and efficient. That's what happened in California. That's what happened in the Holocaust. That's what happened in lots of genocides. And then there's a switch to incarcerating people and killing them in carceral conditions. That's very much what happened in California. So there may have been a rhetoric of protecting people and providing them with a safe haven, but what in fact happened in California was that people were incarcerated on reservations, and they got to reservations and there really wasn't anything there to protect them. And then Congress kept cutting the budget for California's reservations, which meant there was less and less money for the basic essentials like housing, like food, like medical care, and people were dying in large numbers. But they were also very explicitly predated upon. There are multiple massacres that are described on the book that take place on reservations, sometimes carried out by the very reservation officials who have been tasked with protecting and caring for Native people on the reservation. They're the ones carrying out mass killings or enslaving people and treating people as disposable slaves to be worked to death.
A couple of people have asked about the use of the term Indian or Native American or indigenous peoples, and how you've used that in the book and how you've kind of used that in the talk. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you do that and when you use which term?
That's a great question. And this is a moving target. And there's often a lot of disparity between what's happening in Indian country and what's happening in the academy or in US cities. Different terms are being used. So, sometimes when I have presented on a reservation in a rural area, people have laughed at me if I've used the term indigenous or Native American, whereas maybe in an urban indigenous community, people are expecting to hear the word indigenous or native. And I think it's always changing. Increasingly students at UCLA where I teach are introducing themselves as native or indigenous. But the best practice, I would say, is to identify people by the tribal signifier that they choose. So increasingly, tribal people are using the endonym rather than the exonym, the endonym being the name in their own language that they call themselves, whereas the exonym is often from the outside. So what I've tried to do in this book is to name people by their tribal nation wherever possible. And I try to only use Native American or American Indian when it's really tough to identify who we're talking about or to generalize. But we do have 109 separate federally recognized tribal nations in California, as well as dozens of other tribal nations that are not recognized by the federal government. So it's a very complex tapestry of peoples here in California with, depending on how you count it, 5 to 7 different language groups, as compared to Europe only has a couple of language groups. So this is one of the most linguistically diverse places on earth, long before any newcomers get here, even when it's just the original indigenous peoples of the state.
I was going to say this question for a little later, but since you brought up the sanctioned tribes, what is the process for tribes to be recognized, and why are some still not recognized? Why is it so hard for the tribes to become recognized?
So there are a couple of different pathways to recognition by Washington, D.C. One is to go through the Bureau of Indian Affairs. That's a long and cumbersome process that usually involves spending a great deal of money and amassing a huge amount of paperwork to show cultural and political continuity in one place, effectively from time immemorial up to the present. UCLA American Indian Studies has worked with a number of different tribes. Our closest and most intense engagement, I guess, would be with the Tataviam peoples of the San Fernando Valley. It can also happen through a federal bill. So the 2010 Defense Spending Act included a rider which granted federal recognition to Grayton Rancheria, which is not too far from the San Francisco Bay Area. That's in Rohnert Park in Sonoma County. That's another way. But it can also happen through an executive order. We have some tribes that are granted recognition here in California through executive order from the Oval Office. And then the final way would be through a federal court proceeding. So a lot of tribes in California were terminated under the terms of the Rancheria Act, terminated dozens of tribes. And then a lot of tribes have been reinstated through court cases. So that's quite complicated. That's not really what this book is about. But a lot of this book's underlying themes are about land and sovereignty, because the genocide is very much about destroying people to take their land and to erase their sovereignty.
There are a couple of comments about as all of these activities, the militias were happening and the sanctioned killings, and what were there protests against it? Were white people doing anything against to stop it, right? To speak out about it? Or was that just not a thing that happened?
Absolutely. There were US Army officers who said, I won't do this, and even brought guns to bear to stop others from killing. There were politicians, both in the California Senate and in the California Assembly, who stood up against this. And there were even United States congressmen and United States senators from other states in the United States who tried to stop this and stood up against it. What happened was that in California, the overwhelming majority of voters, who remember a pretty restricted group compared to now, they're white men and property holders, those people who were voters overwhelmingly supported this project because it was remunerative. It paid many people a lot of money. And the federal government coughed up the majority of the sum. So people could actually make more money committing genocide, hunting down Indian people. It was more guaranteed and more stable than mining for gold or harvesting timber or trying to raise a wheat crop or breed cattle. So there's a huge amount of money. In fact, for the first few years of California statehood, by far the single biggest expenditure each year are these bills to fund the California volunteer state militias to hunt Indian people.
Wow. Well, many of us have heard about the conflicts, right, between the colonizers, the white people that came in, and the indigenous peoples. The small conflicts. Were there, and you talked about some of their efforts to kind of fight back. Were there major movements by the indigenous people to, as resistance, other than fighting back? What did that look like?
Yeah, people had a whole variety of strategies deployed in order to survive. And those strategies are really a demonstration of genius, because people survived against absolutely incredible odds. They had the army hunting them. They had these California state militias hunting them. Sometimes they had local law enforcement like sheriffs hunting them. There were vigilantes. There were even people who were paid by their local communities as a full-time job just to be hunting and killing Native American people in California. So they survived against these incredible odds. One way that they did so was by fighting back. There are numerous instances in which Native people gave their lives to fight rearguard actions to allow other members of their community to escape. It became increasingly difficult to do this because the state of California made it illegal for Indians to purchase or own either firearms or ammunition. That started in 1854. And so people began to switch more and more to retreat. And so they retreated further into the desert, higher up into the mountains, into swamps, into more remote, harder to access places. And they concealed themselves quite successfully. That's how people survived. But they also sometimes concealed themselves in broad daylight by simply changing their identities, by marrying non-Indian people, by finding folks who would protect them if they worked on their farm or in their mine, etc. So there are a whole host of survival tactics and strategies that folks deployed in order to survive.
We're just about the top of the hour, but there are a couple more questions that I want to get in here, so I'm not going to let you go just yet. So,
sure.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research and how long you worked on this book? And you shared some amazing photos and illustrations on the screen and telling the story. How you came across those and were able to use those in the book.
So, some things came to me from tribal sources. For example, that final picture that I showed of the reenactment of the Round Valley Walk, although that came from the US Forest Service, that was first pointed out to me by people at Round Valley. I think the very last photograph in the book was given to me by the Modoc tribe of Oklahoma when I went out there to present, talk to them about the work. And sometimes I just uncovered things serendipitously in the archives. That handbill in French from Southern California for the sale of a 16-year-old California Indian female, that I just came upon. And what I found ultimately was that a lot of this stuff is just sitting there in plain sight. Much of the material that is in this book comes from the US militia records, from the US Army records, and quite surprisingly, it's just in the newspapers. So I spent years reading California newspapers from this period, and that was one of the most obvious sources that got me started in sort of pinpointing where things happen, and then I could find other sources to corroborate them. Something else that was very useful in this project is I visited many tribes repeatedly. And so while I don't record interviews, I received really important clues meeting with tribal citizens up and down the state about where to look in the archive. And that came from songs, it came from genealogies, and it came from this really deep indigenous archive that exists in people's knowledge. Because if you preserve your history through oral retellings, it has all the density and particularity and detail that a written history does. It's just stored up here rather than on a piece of paper, and it's told orally.
I was really moved by Sally Bell's quote that you shared, and I was wondering, did you have access to oral histories and stories?
Yeah, so her that narrative is collected in the early 20th century when she was an elder, and there are a number of accounts like that that were useful. But the native voices are rather lonely voices because so many people were killed. The real backbone of this book is non-native sources. And I really tried to look at the voices of the perpetrators because I was organizing this in a way like a prosecution. And the most striking, incriminating evidence is when the people who did the killing explain exactly how they did it. And as you'll see if you read the book, there are literally hundreds of declarations of genocidal intent where army officers or journalists or political leaders say, it's our intent to go to this place and kill everyone and to wipe this tribal nation off the face of the earth permanently.
That's horrible.
And I will say, you know, somebody asked about the press. I will say that Yale University Press was incredibly supportive. And if you get the hardback edition of the book, there are about 200 pages of appendices that list all the killings. And we've now digitized it through state parks, through the Digital Atlas of California Native Americans. We've actually scanned in links so that you can go and see the primary sources from which I draw to document each and every one of the killings in both directions. All of the Native California people killed by newcomers, and also all of the newcomers killed by California Indian people. And then you can map that by region around the state of California to kind of see what has happened in your area of the state.
I'll send out a link to everyone who's here tonight and who's registered about how to get the book and more information about you. So don't feel like you have to scramble right now to another tab and look for it in your browser. But we are out of time, and I'm going to close with one question which I thought about myself, which is from Julie, and she talks about you know, how do you feel emotionally from collecting these stories, writing this book, especially as a white man living in California? Like, how has this affected you personally?
Well, you know, I don't think it's up to me to set the course of policy that emanates from this book, but it has been gratifying to see some things change as a result of this. And, you know, I see tribal leaders up and down the state talking about this book, sharing it with our state's legislators. And I'm happy that it's begun a conversation about something so profoundly troubling. I will say, you know, there are costs to an author and to a researcher doing such upsetting work. It's fundamentally changed forever how I see my home state where I grew up, because when I drive around or backpack around now in the state, I have this sense that the Golden State is pockmarked with these bloodstains where these horrible crimes against humanity happened, with the full sanction of the state of California behind them.
Yeah.
And I think the fundamental question for me is, we can't bring back the dead. That's impossible. But we can think about what the state of California owes to California Indian people. And as an educator, I'm focused on telling people this history, because it's really up to all of you to figure out how, in some small measure, we might be able to make this a little bit more equitable and a little bit more right, even if we can never come close to fixing it.
Yes, exactly. I was going to ask you, you know, what can people do to now, right, or to find out more on this topic? And if you have some resources that you want to share with us, we'd love you to do that. You can share them with me, and I can share them with everyone later. But I think people leaving tonight's presentation will want to know more and learn more and do more.
Well, you know, we live in a democracy, so you can be active. You can write a letter to your congressman, to one of our federal senators, to your state assemblyman, to your state senator, to your school board. And one of the things that we need is for people to know about this history. And so we really must change our educational system in California, which almost entirely erases California Indians. It's only there as a requirement in the 4th grade. And then most of our students are studying the architecture of California missions rather than the original people who lived in this state for well more than 14,000 years and who have tremendously complex and wonderful cultures about which our kids just don't really have the opportunity to learn because it's not part of the state educational standards. That's one of the things I'm interested in as an educator, but there are many other issues. Depends on what you're interested in. Dams, water, access to sacred places, making it possible for California Indian people to hunt and gather and fish in their usual and accustomed places. There are a lot of issues that need to be addressed, but I'm just focused on this basic ignorance in California about California's indigenous history.
Well, thank you so much for bringing this important topic to the book club audience tonight. I think there's a lot for us to think about and for us to process, and we really appreciate having you here tonight. So thank you to our presenter, Benjamin Madley, and to you, everyone out there attending this Book Club of California program tonight. I hope you'll join us for our next program. It's titled Contempo Joe Mora. It's a week from tonight, Monday, March 30th at 6 p.m. It's a live in-person program that will also be Zoomed. Peter Hiller, who's an author, historian, and the Joe Mora collection curator for the Monterey History and Art Association, will discuss the creative career of Joseph Jacinto Joe Mora and how Joe Mora's art has and continues to find its way into popular culture and the wider world in both traditional and surprising ways. It's also the subject of the current exhibition here at the book club. You can register for that event online at bccbooks.org/programs or using the link in the weekly programs emails that you may be receiving from the Book Club of California. Thanks everyone for joining us this evening. I hope you have a wonderful evening. Be well and take care of yourself. We'll see you again soon. Thanks, Benjamin.
Thank you very much.
Good night, everyone.